You informed.
Demerara and Essequibo 99.1 FM.
Burby's 99.5 FM. Kaieteur Radio.
Guyana is now a full-fledged oil-producing nation. But how much do you know about this valuable yet finite resource? On our radio program, Guyana's Oil and You, we strike at the heart of every issue with informed views and credible data. The time is now for you to arm yourself with insightful knowledge on your oil wealth. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this week's episode of Guyana's Oil and You. I'm your hostess, senior journalist of Kaieteur News, Kiana Wilberg, and tonight we continue the discussion on local content. To help us this evening is GCCI President, Mr. Timothy Tucker. Sir, welcome to the program. Thanks for being here.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me on your program.
All right, so we'll get straight into our program this evening, sir. First of all, I'd like to outline that the Georgetown Chamber of Commerce and Industry has been one of the key stakeholders in the fight for local content in Guyana ever since it was even in the public domain as a matter of discussion. Can you give us some reflections on some of the demands that GCCI has been making over the years for maximizing the participation and the benefits to Guyanese?
Well, GCCI, I think GCCI put local content in the public domain, and it was going back to 2017, and it's due to the fact that the GCCI fields trade missions and of course receives trade missions in Guyana as a Chamber of Commerce. And when we had fielded our trade mission to Newfoundland and Labrador, the then president of the Chamber had a lot of interactions, and we were fascinated by what the oil and gas industry, how the oil and gas industry had transformed Newfoundland, and some of their stories and what they were telling us, even and when they were, we received multiple trade missions from them. And the key points to them were, you have to make sure that the locals benefit from this natural resource. And they showed us the way, they showed us the importance of local content. And more so, it had a lot to do with the fact that the local private sector had no clue. And everything was going on around us, and we didn't know what it is. We didn't know how to get into it. We didn't know how to be involved. We didn't understand the industry. So that led to us pushing for local content and demanding that, listen, we need to have at least a policy in place. This is 2017. The GCCI wrote its own policy, submitted to the then government. We pushed because they were low-hanging fruits. They were basic services, basic stuff, skills that Guyanese could have done. We were looking around. You see a truck. Somebody had to import a truck to move pipes, and we're like, there's so many trucks. We've been moving containers. We've been moving excavators from Georgetown till into the interior. We've been moving heavy equipment for the mining industry for years, the bauxite industry. We've evolved as a private sector over the years. So we started to demand, information, demand what access to what kind of services. We saw the setting up of the Center of Local Business Development to give us some information. But the information was always very slow and trickling, and it was, as you beg, you got. And you really had to beg. So we started to make demands. And of course, those demands, they were heard, but still they were very slow. in coming across. And so we keep pushing and keep pushing, and then we ended up with a local content legislation that really covers, and the GCCI, along with many other sectorial bodies, really had a say in what was listed in the first schedule of the local content, based on existing capacity that and how we saw it. Not saying, I mean, and now that it's in, and now you've seen people registering, you get a real sense of how much Guyanese can do. So I expect that those 40 areas in the revision, end of year revision of the legislation or the act, to be, I'm sure they'll be extended, and you'll have at least 45 to 50 areas. It will go from 40 to about 45, 50, or even more.
Thanks, Mr. Thacker. Now, I would just like to know how does the legislation, because you touched on that a bit, how does the legislation live up to the expectations of GCCI, given what you've been demanding?
So the legislation, it creates the opportunities in the areas that we have existing capacity, but it also creates the opportunities for us to understand the industry. If you look at the legislation, you'll see at the end of, I think it's going to be end of year, there will be a report presented to Parliament. The minister, in the legislation, it says the minister has to present a report outlining each operator, licensee, subcontractor has to submit, right, their local content plan, either annually or their 5-year procurement plan or local content plan, and outlining the areas and of course their spend, the opportunities, breaking out the sector. The capturing of that information is pivotal to the development of the local private sector. Providing that information is handed to the public and handed to the private sector and of course the general citizens of Guyana. That's how we'll know where the opportunities and where we can take advantage. We don't have to wait 100 years to evolve, but we can speed up the process by the reporting aspects that is labeled in the legislation. And once that is given out to or presented to Parliament, that's a public document. And I'm sure Kaieteur News will put it on their front, in their papers, so that the public can see it.
Absolutely, sir. Now, one of the things with local content policies that's considered some of the fundamental principles, they're expected to be simple, maximize benefits for citizens, ensure transparency, and be armed with mechanisms that keep schemers at bay. How many of these boxes do you think our legislation ticks?
Our legislation ticks a lot of boxes. What we don't see in the legislation, and it's actually there, because I would have spoken to the a few authors of the few people behind the background of the legislation, and of course there are guidelines.
Yes.
So there are guidelines, and those guidelines help the Secretariat to really flush out, look deeply into the persons applying. To see whether they're schemers, whether they're legitimate businesses, and of course, how they're made up. Because some of the documents you have to submit, if you're a company, you have to submit all your bylaws, your entire company documents, all the shareholders, the makeup of your board, your resolutions, how it's split, how the profits are split, and everything has to be submitted. Those are the documents that they're requiring, the Secretariat is presently requiring from you. And they're not just asking you to email it or send it, they're asking you to take it in personally. So you're not looking at the person and name and say, oh, he's Guyanese. They want to physically see the Guyanese that is behind this company. And that's, it has its pros and cons. One of the cons for it is that it's taking a longer time.
Yes, slowing up the process.
Right, it's slowing up the process, but scrutiny, due diligence is important, and to make sure that our legislation isn't used against us. So even though we are all, why everything is taking so long, appreciate the fact that they're doing their work. They have lawyers. They're going to do background checks. They're going into the deeds registry. They're doing their investigation. It's painstaking. I had to go through it. It took some time, but I appreciate the work the Secretariat is doing. This is something new, and I think they've done a fairly good job to date. You have about 170 local businesses registered already. There are over 100 and maybe 130 of them waiting to be registered, or should I say applications are in. And think about it, that they have to go through that every single day.
That's 130 waiting to be vetted.
130 that presently are being vetted.
Oh.
So 170 have gotten through, got their local content certificate and can operate. 130 people, they're going through right now the process. 130 businesses. And so that's important, that, it's not a case where somebody comes in today and, understand as well, if Guyana sends an application in, right, and you are a partner and you have equity and they can see it's a field that you've been in before. So let's say you want to do public relations for your oil and gas company. You created a public relations company. You are a familiar and a popular person in Guyana. The Secretariat doesn't need to go and look to see who you are and where you are.
Right.
Right? So half of that process time is cut. When you're unknown, it'll take some time. They have to really go and see, is this a legitimate person? Does he have a legitimate business? She has so those take time. Especially persons who are trying to apply, Guyanese living abroad now trying to return. They haven't set foot in Guyana in maybe 20 years.
But what is the GCCI's position on that? Are you open to Guyanese returning, given the fact that we do have a labor shortage? Are you open to the idea and supportive of Guyanese returning, forming joint ventures with companies that take part in the sector?
We are supportive of persons returning. We always support the diaspora coming back to Guyana. But we want to make sure that they come back and really come back. I am not supportive of persons using their Guyanese citizenship from afar. Right? If you're returning Guyanese, there are certain requirements that you must conform to based on your remigrant status. Ministry of Foreign Affairs, GRA, they all require a certain amount of things. You have to be in Guyana for a minimum of 6 months. You must have moved your assets. You must be back here. You must show proof that you're back. And I think some sort of proof of residency should be required. I understand that you want to invest. If you're going to invest in the equity. Just don't use your birth certificate and expect all doors should be open when you're not doing anything better than the expats. Actually, the expats, if you look at it, the expats are in country. They are in country. They're renting property. They're buying groceries. They're using the services locally. When you have a Guyanese abroad and they refuse to come back, but yet they want to use their citizenship that they gave up to benefit them without investing anything into Guyana, that's troubling, right? But the legislation is plain, the requirements are straightforward, and I trust the Secretariat to do what they have to do.
Now, one of the issues that the GCCI has been championing over the years, that's been for early payment periods. There have been complaints about 90 days, 60 days, or sometimes even longer than that. And now the Local Content Secretariat has taken a step to really stem that tide. And I think today they sent out a press release where they disclosed that some of the oil and gas companies have agreed to amend their local content plans to do 45 or 30-day payment period. What is the take of GCCI on this? Do you consider it a win?
We consider it a win. A lot of our members are the ones that were complaining. We had companies within our membership that were owed, almost $1 million US for 200 days.
Wow.
You can imagine the interest rates, the impact on that business, the cash flow. This is a society that we are a country that has an access to finance issue.
Yes.
Right? And we have an access to finance issue is something access to finance is our greatest hindrance to local content. We can only benefit fully from local content if we have better, cheaper access to finance. And that's your underlining statement that has to be made. What is important is in the second schedule of the local content legislation, if you go down, you can see there is a part in your procurement plan where the companies have an obligation to provide payment terms that foster growth and competitiveness. So when the issue came up with the payment terms, I said, you have it in the legislation. This is where you can use it. Because I saw that. And the Secretariat, they discussed it with their legal team, and they actually went ahead and used that to implement what they're doing now. So the important thing there is that a lot of things are in this legislation, and that's why you see the GCCI has always been in support of this legislation. But it's unfortunate that it took the government to say to the subcontractors that, listen, you have to pay in this period of time.
Right.
The operator pays the operators pay the subcontractors in very good timing, right? So you will see our statement that we sent out today refer to the subcontractors. Correct. Because that's where all our complaints come from. It doesn't come from the operator. I don't think we've gotten a complaint about Exxon's payments. Mind you, we don't have a lot of members that are Guyanese companies that are direct subcontractors to Exxon. We have members that are, because we have the subcontractors as members. We've spoken to them previously. But I mean, sometimes we say government has to force the private sector to do what is right for the private sector. Right? And that part is unfortunate because a private sector never wants to see too much regulations, right? But in this case, we're happy, we welcome it, and we're delighted to see that at least 2 subcontractors have already done the right thing.
Right.
And we don't have to see an amended local content legislation, right, stipulating, lining out that you must be in this. They've used something to say your procurement plan must foster that.
Right. Thank you for that comment there. Now, I wanted to ask you about one of your members, actually, Ramps Logistics Guyana, a company that has been here even before the emergence of the local content legislation, and it has said it's being denied a local content certificate. Has a GCCI sought to intervene on behalf of one of its members before the Secretariat to understand really what is the root cause of this issue?
Well, unfortunately, Ramps Logistics is a member.
Yes.
They have never reached out to the GCCI for help. And actually, I was just like the rest of the public, only aware of what was going on when they went on their press conference. I know that there were some delays, but as I said, there are many companies within the GCCI that are still waiting for their local content. So when the first I heard of it, I heard that it was taking long for them to get it. And I said, well, everybody's in that same boat. But I did not know that they had gotten a letter that they got rejected and that sort of thing. And I've said, the GCCI operates in a very formal way where if any member of the chamber has an issue, you have to put it in writing.
Right.
And I will myself and the executive of the chamber and the council of the chamber will act on it. We will write the minister. We've done that many occasions. So I've said to Rams, just send me a letter. That's subsequent to that. I said, you just send me a letter. And I actually, just recently again, I said, because they would have now gotten a letter from the government rejecting from the secretariat, then they would have gotten the reasons why,
Right.
and they would have amended their application and they would have sent it
Yes.
back.
Yes.
And I can say, and so as far as Rams, I've not gotten any further update from Rams, from the secretariat on their application process. And I did say to the owners of Rams, if you need clarification at this time, write me and I will seek it on your behalf. Because then I have the authority to act on their behalf.
Right.
I can't take it on to myself
Yes.
to act on their behalf. No. Again, we have to understand the public perception
Right.
and the intent of the legislation. The intent of the legislation was always to create industries that, or should I say, not create, but to take industries that already existed, that have percentages of capacity to serve the sector, and carve out them to protect them from foreign competition, right? So it's a protection to give them opportunity. And that's what the legislation did with the first schedule. Now, it's always going to be a difficult sell when someone comes with a partnership to get the wins or to get the fruit, the low-hanging fruit that was placed for locals. So you're always going to have that public perception, and we have to look at the legislation because that was the purpose. That was always
Right.
the intent, and law is about the intent of the law. I'm not a lawyer, but I've sat with many lawyers as a businessman, and they always say it's the intent of the legislation, and
Right.
the intent definitely speaks to giving opportunity for locals. So you have a situation now where you have Guyanese, second generation Guyanese, partnering with a company that is already here,
Yes.
doing services that have been carved out for Guyanese, and using that now to get into the sector as a Guyanese company. And you will always have the public perception that is wrong. As I said, until the guidelines that govern this act is published or sent into public, then we will know that if that is the right thing or that is the wrong thing, right? Because
Right.
we've seen examples from around the world that says, you must share in the spoils, you must share in the victories, right? And you must be a genuine partner, right? The jury is out, but of course, and time will tell.
So it's from what you have observed, there isn't, in your view, any unfair treatment. It's just there really is a large pool of companies that basically have to wait in line.
When I got my company got its local content certificate, I had a whole set of messages coming in on my phone. So what about mine? Why I've been waiting months. So there are a lot of people waiting, and we have to go. I waited months, and you have to go through a process,
Right.
right? And in all fairness, we've been the members of the GCC. I've been in the forefront of fighting for local content, but we still had to prove. I still had to take my documents personally into the secretariat and said, "I'm Timothy Tucker. This is my company. Here's my documents."
Right. So this brings us to the next aspect of our discussion, and that has to do with how joint venture partnerships are formed. There are several case studies that one can point to about the principles that should be adhered to or followed to ensure that You know, you have a foolproof system when companies form partnerships to get into the oil and gas sector. What's your take on the type of issues that have been arising about joint venture partnerships? How do you think we can improve on that?
Joint venture partnerships, you have to, I believe a joint venture, right, should always be a relationship that benefits the parties involved equally or based on what their agreement, the joint venture agreement stipulates.
Right.
So if I have 51% of a company, I'm expecting when that company becomes profitable, I will get 51% of the profit. If I am 51% controller, shareholder in a company, I expect to have the voting rights that represents 51. I cannot be 51% of the company and be secondary to the person that owns 49%.
Right.
If I have 51% of a company, I could tell you I have a partnership. It's not 51-49, it's actually 50-50, right? So that's not going to be a local content company. It's 100% staff Guyanese, right? Managed 100% Guyanese. I own 51% of it, right? My business partner has the other 50%. I put into it office space, vehicles, and sweat equity. He placed his connections with the suppliers. He had an existing company. He had a supply network. He had about 18 brands, but we are a partnership. And so I work in that company. I work with that company. We grow that company together. And when that company becomes profitable, I expect 50% of the profits, right? And so I have placed in that partnership my time, my effort, my money, and my space, my building, my vehicles. And he has done his part. That is joint ventureship. That is partnership, right? You have to be, you can invest in a company, there can be investors, you can have invested in the company, but if you're investing and you're taking 51% of the company, it has to be that way. And especially in the context of local content, right? Which now says you must be a beneficial owner. So that word beneficial owner goes down. It's not, and we've seen persons try to do secondary shares. They try to do preferential shares. They try to do investment returns. So basically, the shareholder and the overseas company that's coming in is loaning equipment and selling equipment to the local company, which has to pay back that company first. And that may be over a 5 to 10 year period. Because if you got to pay back 100 million US, how long is it going to take you to pay that back before you can get a profit? So some of these things are deliberately created to circumvent the legislation. And I believe those are some of the things that the Secretariat is looking for. And that's when they see companies coming, they start to ask more questions. Because when you see a person buy a company that is making, let's say, 25 million US, and you're making 5 million US a year, and you're getting a contract for 5 years, right? So 5 million US is 25 million US over the next 5 years, and I'm letting you buy into that company for, let's say, 500,000 US. And I'm giving you 51% of one contract I have that's 25 million over the next 5 years. I'm giving you 500,000 buy-in and giving you 51% of that. Something is not right there. So those are the things that they're looking for, and those are the things that now have to be, we gotta decipher, go through, and see how we can create a guideline for companies coming in, say, look, these are the things you require to produce this bit of information annually, because you can get your certificate this year and you could get it revoked next year because it's
Right.
an annual renewal, right? And I do have some good news. I know that the Secretariat is working on their joint venture guidelines.
Oh, that
So
is interesting.
I do have that to tell you. Secretariat, and they will be publishing a draft for public review first, and then they will make it final.
Oh,
So
well,
they will
that
have
is
consultations
definitely
with the
so.
private sector to see
Yeah.
if this is what I spoke to them, and that's what because the GCCI, at the GCCI we have constant communication meetings with the local content secretariat. The private sector commission created a local content advisory committee. Mr. Sham Nocta is the chair of that committee.
Okay.
I sit in that committee. Mr. Richard Rambaran, Nicholas Degu, Melissa Van Wyck, and there's also Joel Bagwandin, Paul Chung, and a few other people that are sitting on that committee that do have constant meetings dealing with issues that are, every time we have a meeting, we send out emails to our entire membership saying, do you have any issues with the legislation? Do you have any issues that need to be resolved with the Secretariat? Then we sit with the Secretariat and we discuss the issues that our members are having. So
Wow.
it's constant moving and making sure what we fought for is working in our benefit.
So you are also, and you're telling me now that the GCCI is like an added layer of oversight,
Yes.
working alongside the government in ensuring the legislation works. That's really good.
And we've had,
Kudos to you.
I can say we've had excellent support from the Secretariat, the Minister. They've always made themselves available to us at a moment's notice.
Excellent. Now, sir, before we had the local content legislation and the Secretariat, there was the Center for Local Business Development, which is the brainchild of ExxonMobil and its partners, a portal that allows for, Guyanese companies to be registered and for companies to be able to put their tenders, have their pick, etc., of companies that are already vetted. Do you think now with the legislation and the Secretariat in place, do you think in any way that it conflicts with the current objectives of the Secretariat, or does it need to be modified now to fit the new dispensation?
I think that the CLDB will need to be modified, and I must say the CLDB is a member of the GCCI. I have also registered with the CLDB personally with my businesses. The training that the CLDB offers makes the CLDB different from what the Secretariat is doing. Now, the Secretariat is where companies register.
Right.
Is a registrar for local businesses.
Right.
It was enacted by a law. It covers and it deals specifically with the legislation and the requirements of the legislation, and so it also deals with the procurement, the advertising of tenders, and so forth. CLDB is a support mechanism. I still see some tenders going out saying that you must be registered with the CLDB. We will need to clarify that, because the only place that you must be registered is with the local content secretariat. So I don't know if maybe the companies want an additional layer, and I would have to be guided by the secretary to find out if that can be allowed. I'm not quite sure about that one, but I can say CLDB with access to finance, creating, helping you with ISO, helping you understanding the oil and gas industry, They offer a lot of courses. They're very helpful to the private sector and to the general public. Even bookkeeping.
So it will still be essential to the oil and gas framework, the
It
local
definitely-
content drive.
Yeah, it definitely will,
Right.
and I believe it should remain as a support mechanism for Guyanese.
Now, touching on a comment that you made earlier about access to finance being the greatest hindrance to local content, some countries that have also faced this challenge have said, you know what? Well, let's create a fund, a local content fund, where companies they put in a fee, and small businesses, small and medium scale businesses that are trying to enter the sector, they're able to tap that fund. Do you think that we can perhaps have some type of solution like that to give easier access to companies?
We would definitely like something like that, but at the end of the day, is it sustainable? When oil prices drop, is that fund going to be sustainable? Are you going to end up, and I know that the big issue is that you've had similar funds, banks created, the government had been into banking before,
Yeah.
and they got burned and they left it. I believe that finance should be driven by the private sector. We should not be relying on the government to fund the private sector. We should be able to have the mechanisms, create the environment that allows the mechanisms for access to finance. There are plenty of things that can be done. I mean, one of the biggest hindrances is our inability to borrow on invoicing, to borrow on contracts, to borrow on movable equipment.
But wasn't there a conversation from GCCI in trying to move that, trying to make some success where that is concerned with the banking sector?
GCCI has always been pushing and fighting on that one. We've reached to the point where we have identified one of the issues, well, part of the legislation that needs to be changed. The Attorney General is aware of that, the Minister of Finance is aware of that. The Bank of Guyana says, from the regulation standpoint, there's nothing stopping it. So there is a few laws. The government is very much open, and they're willing to change those laws to allow it. We believe that and that's one of the main reasons that I think that
This is outside of the local content legislation.
Yeah, this is access.
Okay.
This is strictly access to finance. This is for everybody, right? Because access to finance is a national issue. It's not even a Guyana issue. It's a regional issue.
Right.
Up to yesterday, you saw Prime Minister Motley testifying in front of the U.S. Congress on access to finance for the Caribbean. And of course, you see in Guyana, we have and I would say that over the years, the banking sector has been very risk averse. They don't take a lot of risks. If you go back to 2008, though, you can say the mechanisms that have been put in place by government and by the central bank has insulated Guyana's banking sector from collapse, right? But I think at this point in time, you need to open up to allow the private sector to access that finance, and not just the private sector. The big businesses, they have access to finance. The money the kind of money that they want, they'll have to go overseas to borrow. Different multinational lending agencies, sovereign wealth funds, and capital markets, and equity buy-ins and things like that. They will be able to go and do so. Who needs the money is the micro, small, and medium-sized businesses. Medium-sized businesses is the forgotten business because they're in a critical point. They're not small enough to get small business grants, right? And they're not large enough to get big business big loans, because they don't. Most medium businesses are still struggling to develop their business, and they don't have the assets that they need to leverage.
Right.
Right? You need to grow the business to get the money, then to get the assets. And that's the thing, because if you don't have the assets, you can't get the money from the bank. So they're locked there. That's a big issue. And so that's why I'm saying that access to finance is such a critical issue, because how does that small business or that medium-sized business do work within the 40 areas that are placed in the local content? How do you, when the oil and gas industry is a capital intense industry, that industry now requires, as we said, you got big companies asking for them to pay them their money within 30 to 45 days. Right? So you could imagine a medium-sized business that doesn't have the assets using their cash flow to do services for the oil and gas industry, and then have to wait 90 days for that.
Right.
You're bankrupt, right? Or you just can't enter because you don't have the cash to do so. So that's why access to finance is such an important part, because it is going to give the entrepreneur who now thinks, you know what, maybe I can get into the oil and gas industry, and he goes and he looks through all the different things in the oil and gas industry, decides this is the one that I'm going to do, but where do I get the money to do this?
So, based on discussions GCCI has had with government, you have you've seen or observed government's openness to making the legislative changes that are necessary to improve the conditions for access to financing.
Yes, I do see that.
Right.
One important thing to say, though, that we have there's an issue in Guyana, though, that is creating the problem too. And you know, as we got somewhat of a tongue lashing last night from Dr. Singh about it from the private sector. Had a dinner last night, and Minister said to us, the private sector needs to be honest about their business, right? And being honest about your business means reporting your correct earnings, because you can't go to the bank. You can't understate your business and your income and then go to the bank and expect to get a big loan. Mm-hmm. So that's an issue that we have to face. But what has happened over the years is that companies have been reluctant to go incorporate, and the banking sector wants to see audited financial statements. Sole proprietors, sole traders do not have to get audited financial statements. So these are some of the things that we also from the private sector really have to start looking and say, listen, we need to regularize and run our businesses properly. Structure, you're now if you're an incorporated entity, you report, your business looks good, your cash flow looks mm-hmm. good, and the banks, of course, have to do their part, because they have not been doing their part. I think there's a big issue with the banking sector where they've been very reluctant to lend the private sector money. You can go easily and buy an asset, an immovable asset, or an asset that carries that can be levied, a car, a house, and things like that, a piece of land. But from the time you start to go for other things to support your business, a business idea,
mm-hmm.
The bank suddenly decides we're not going to risk that.
Okay, so to my penultimate question, and thanks for that very interesting perspective there. Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago, both CARICOM nations, have expressed an interest over the years in working with each other on a number of issues. But how important do you think it is for both countries to have a united front, especially in these times, on energy? And how do you think we can work through? What are some of the issues, the teething problems that we need to address where trade is concerned? Because oftentimes when the conversation comes up about Guyana and Trinidad working together, then there's then you need to fix the trade barriers first. So can you give us some perspective on those two interrelated matters?
I will quote the president on this one and Prime Minister Motley. The two of them have a saying. They go around the region saying, right, the coalition of the willing. Mm-hmm. And right. they use that term to say that the problems of the Caribbean, with us being one, mm-hmm. right, can be solved quickly. Mm-hmm. But you must be willing to solve it. Mm-hmm. And if you're not willing to solve the issues that are creating rifts, that are creating the inequality throughout the region, then it makes no sense. And people often say over the years, oh, you know, the GCCI is complaining about honey and pumpkins and plantains and, you know, these $100 and $200 and $16,000 a gallon for honey. But it creates a market for the farmer that is somewhere in the back dam struggling to grow his provision, his plantains, getting small amounts because the market can't take off the amount that he has. If we export it, then, or we create value added, we know the issue with value added and electricity. So we are exporting it to a country that already is doing value added. But you can't because of some stupid reason that somebody at a port decided, you know, we don't want plantains, we don't want pineapples coming from Guyana. They're bringing pineapples from Puerto Rico into
Yes.
with the crowns on, but you're decrowning the pineapple from Guyana, right? You're putting hydrochloric acid on Edos coming from Guyana, right? You are giving Guyanese a hassle with CSME certificates. Guyanese have complained to me, working in Trinidad, complaining to me about the CSME certificates, that they're issued a CSME certificate from Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Guyana. They go there, they got to go and get a new one from the Trinidad Foreign Affairs Ministry, right? They got to go and renew their, if they're using their Guyanese one, they got to go and renew it annually. CSME certificates are issued in the country that you, of origin, that you're from, that you've educated yourself and you're a professional. And you use that to gain employment throughout the Caribbean. You're supposed to do so freely. And whenever you're asked, you present your certificate, right? I've spoken to the Secretary General of CARICOM, and I've spoken to many people, including the Foreign Affairs Minister of Trinidad and the Trade Minister, and they said you do not need to do that to go and get it. But yet they require, their immigration and their the offices are requiring that. So the little things as honey, the little things as a CSME certificate, and all these little things combined, if you can't remove those, then why do you want to talk about oil and gas? Oil and gas is a big thing.
Right.
But you show, in a relationship, you show friendship, honesty, trust, and camaraderie, right? From the basic things. And if you can't eliminate the basic things, then why should we even talk about the bigger things? Mm-hmm. So having said that, though, we have moved. There's a task force that has been set up between the two countries.
Right.
That have been dealing. Guyana has listed, worked through all of their issues, not just for Trinidad, but for the entire CARICOM. All the countries that we have trade issues with, there's been a task force. There's a document, and their action items have been presented to the Trinidad government for them to action now. And similarly, they have presented things to the Guyana government that they would like to see actioned. So we are waiting for those things resolved. When I was part of the delegation that went to Trinidad, we were in the room that was handed over to the Trinidad government. Prime Minister Rowley indicated that they are going to respond to everything, and of course, they're going to move ahead because, funny enough, a businessman in Trinidad raised the issue of getting his honey into other Caribbean countries, and he's the largest producer of honey in Trinidad. So, and I found that ironic. But to say that, you know, Barbados has already removed, in the stroke of a pen, Prime Minister Motley removed a lot of the hindrances for Guyanese products going in there. There's still a few. Some of the regular, of course, at the end of the day, everything is still human. You still, when your container arrives at a port, you still have a person that has to deal with it. And of course, they can use anything to reject it. But more importantly, regional standards is what generally would eliminate everything. Regional phytosanitary standards, regional trade standards, And we see them working now to get those formalized. I think CARICOM has already gone far in creating the regional phytosanitary standards.
Okay, thank you for that. That was actually very interesting. Now, to close tonight's program, I'd like to ask you a two-part question. There are many challenges that will face Guyana, that will fall into our pathway as we develop our oil and gas resources, as our knowledge increases. But what for you is the one that we need to keep our eyes on?
The one thing that we're gonna need to keep our eyes on when it comes in developing our resources, I would say, is to make sure ensure that Guyanese are involved, that whatever's created, whatever industry is created with our natural resources, that we are heavily involved, heavily participating in that industry, and that Guyanese are really getting the benefit of it. Yes, we know that we have to keep an eye on, things like the Sovereign Wealth Fund. We got to keep an eye on the Natural Resource Fund. We got, of course, it's our duty. It's the duty of every citizen to keep their government in check and to ensure that those who are in charge of our resources are doing so prudently, and of course with as much caution, because of course it's our children's wealth, or this is the future. But at this point, and at the point of going forward, as a Guyanese citizen getting to work every day, we have to ensure too that we are benefiting and we're not spectators, right? Mere spectators to the removal of our resources. And it's everything. Everything is your resources, your lumber, even your people. And I think a lot of people forget that. Your most valuable resource is your people. And of course, every day you see people dying recklessly on the roadways. So it's important that, as I would say, one of the major things, and I hope I did get to understand your question correctly,
Yes.
was that we have to make sure and demand our involvement, because you don't want to wait till the Sovereign Wealth Fund. If the Sovereign Wealth Fund creates a trickle down to you, we want involvement. We've seen a lot of countries around the world, right, who have massive amount of wealth, and it never reached down to the people. Right. So you have to create the mechanisms to ensure that some amount of the money is retained in country and spent among its people.
And the final part of my question, it's well known that politics can affect the management of the oil and gas sector, either in a good way or a bad way. What do you want to see in terms of the involvement of the government and the opposition? What role do you want to see them playing in how this resource is managed?
I would say they need to grow up and work together. As bluntly as I can say it, it's too long. You 750,000 people. It's like having a household with under 10 people, and you got a massive amount of wealth, and you can't get along for the benefit of the household. We see politicians, we've been divided so long, and we could never realize our wealth and never realize our true potential as a country if we don't work together. It has to be together. And you got to put your petty differences aside for the good of everyone. And you got to come together and say, listen, if we're gonna, you got to create a national plan. It's not when you come into power, we're gonna paint the buildings in this color, and then when you come out, when somebody else comes, we paint them back in this color, and then we forget to build the road between the two buildings. Right? So I mean, that's as layman as it can
Yes.
get, right? But it's important that we really realize we have a vision together, that regardless if I decide to do this project first or I decided this is the way we can do the project, we know power generation is our major issue. We providing good power generation for our people. We know we need to provide good medical care, a good mass transit system for the country, because if you don't put the mass transit as you grow, it's too much people clustered in an area. We have to get mass transit. You could imagine if you had a light rail running from Perica to New Amsterdam. Well, let's say to Quarantine, and then you had one, or even let's say East Coast, West Bank to East Coast,
Right.
and then Georgetown to Mary. You could imagine the reduction of traffic, right? So we got to be able to collectively agree that these are the things and make sure that we keep each other in check. We're building something and we're making sure that everyone is going to benefit from it and the future.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tucker. I think that is a very good note to end on, that the best way to do it, the only way that we can really maximize and unleash your potential, is to do it together. So that is a beautiful message to end on. And once again, thank you for taking the time to be here tonight to continue the discussion on Guyana's Oil and You. And to our viewers and listeners, wherever you might be, thanks for joining us. Please continue to stay safe and join us next week, same time, same place, for another episode of Guyana's Oil and You. Do have a good evening. And good evening to you, Mr. Tucker.
Good evening, Guyana. Thank you very much for having me.